joined us on the Zoom link. I welcome you to one of our very initial hybrid seminars, and it's always a pleasure to host Adil Najam here. And I thought that no other seminar can actually help us informing our wider audience that we are back in business and we are back to in-person seminar. So thanks, Adil, for being here. Now, we have requested Adil Najam to talk us through about some of the global shifts which are taking place. Global shifts, if we look at unified Europe after this Russia-Ukraine crisis, we can see the NATO again becoming a relevant force. We are talking of other geopolitical and geographical alignments, especially in Eurasia, China, and Russia, and other countries who are vulnerable to American sanctions at one side and America at the other. But not only these, the other shifts like climate change, the commodity prices, oil prices, and some of the domestic shifts which are taking place due to those global shifts which would get affected by those global shifts. So it's a very wide canvas, but I know only Adil can cover this wide canvas and can actually help us connecting the dots and try to take us through somehow connect and relate different standalone events which are taking place across globe in order to make sense and in order to make a small story. So Adil, over to you for your story of today.
Welcome. Thank you very much. I hope people can hear me both here and Zoom. It is always good to come back to SDPI and to meet friends, and thank you for those in the audience who take the time to be here. It is good to see old friends and also new people that I can talk to. So पहले मुझे देखने हैं कि ये मेरी स्क्रीन वाला काम चल रहा है, स्क्रीन वाला काम चल रहा है. Thank you so much. Many, in a way, this is a continuation of, actually every time I talk at SDPI, it is a continuation of previous things. But this is particularly a continuation of some of the thoughts that I had shared the last time I was speaking at SDPI in December, I guess. When I talked about some of the work that I had been doing around post-COVID, or what is the world look like after COVID, or how does it change, or how does it not change. Many of those things we have now seen happening, and I don't know how many people here were part of that conversation or not. I think happening on the internet if we want that context, because I will try not to repeat that. As I said, मुझे always SDPI आने में खास खुशी होती है क्योंकि एक तो अपना घर है. दूसरा, Abid has been very kind always to allow me to test ideas here. So this is my testing ground. और आज वाला बहुत ही ज़्यादा test, in the sense that what I am presenting is literally for the first time in this format. Some of the ideas are obviously idea to बनता है, इसलिए they are built on earlier things. But this is something that I've been thinking about at least for the last 2 years through COVID. But I'm trying to gel it into a, I hope, coherent argument for the first time. अब मैं कर तो रहा हूँ, लेकिन मैं सोच रहा हूँ आप लोग यहाँ क्यों आए और क्या समझ के आए आज के दिन पे. अभी आई एम गेसिंग आप सारे अपना फोन चेक कर रहे हैं कि कुछ होया, कुछ निकला, पता लगे क्या होया कि. So जितनी वो किस्म की सियासत है उसका ये, this is a very diametrically different set of ideas. In fact, it is even less current than most of my talks are. So अगर कुछ हो जाए इसके बीच में प्लीज हाथ उठा के मुझे भी बता दीजिएगा कि क्या निकला, और अगर नहीं निकला तो बाद में हम चाहे तो बैठ के आपस में वो भी बात कर लें. But in some ways, I'm going to take you as far away from that as I possibly can. I hope that you read through the one paragraph, 3 sentence of what this is about. We've tried to sort of create this title because Sara was sort of pushing me. So we said, change. I'm not sure if there are 5. I'm not even sure if the 5 that I'm going to put up are there. As I said, this is really much less of a talk and more of what we research community, it's a seminar in the sense that I have some ideas, I want to throw it on people, I want to see how they react as I gel them. But in my mind, they have been fermenting for a couple of years now, and I do think that even by my usual standards, which is big ideas, these are bigger than those, and they relate to previous things. So we came up with this title, 5 things that are changing the world. And if you take that title seriously, and you should always take the title seriously, and you should always push people to be honest to the titles that they give, then it seems to me that there should be at least 3 questions in your mind that you should be asking. अगर मैं आके इधर claim कर रहा हूँ कि there are some things that are changing the world, तो छोटा-मोटा claim तो नहीं है, ये तो खत लड़ाने जैसा claim, उसको फिर किसी को पूछना पड़ेगा कि ये है कुछ कि नहीं, ठीक है? तो एक हम भी कर लेते हैं मीटिंग इधर सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल की अपनी on my claim that there are certain things. I would argue that there are at least 3 types of interrogation that you should be applying, that I should be applying to what I'm talking about. First, is the world really changing? ऐसा तो नहीं होता कि world कभी भी ना change कर रहा. Change is a constant. Change is always happening. Evolution is a process. So if I or someone is claiming that the world is changing, then we are really claiming that something is happening that is outside of the ordinary. Right? So the 3 tests, as I come to it, let me put them up front. The test I would put myself. And the first of those is the type of things that I will be presenting in the next 10, 15, 20 minutes. Maybe. Are they really meeting this test of being real change? That is change outside of the ordinary. Okay, Ukraine में जंग हुई, उसको पहले जानते नहीं है. आपने अपनी जिंदगी में कौन सा आखिरी वक्त देखा था जब जंग नहीं थी? Can anyone tell? जब भी जंग थी, सीरिया भी जंग थी, तो ऐसा नहीं कि पहली बार ही होगा. उधर यूरोप वालों के साथ हुआ, उनको आदत नहीं है, हमें आदत है, इसलिए वो ज़रा ज़्यादा confused है. That argument can be made, right? So the first test I want you to apply is the world really changing in the sense that whatever change I am suggesting or we are seeing is that outside of the ordinary. Trade embargo भी होती है, disease भी होती है, ताकतें भी ऊपर नीचे जाती. Are we saying a different change? If in fact the answer to that question is yes, if so, then we should be asking, are the changes we are seeing structural and fundamental? अपनी argument को test करना. तो अगर वो change है, तो उसको साबित करने के लिए are the 2 words that I did use in those 3 lines. That my claim is that these are structural and these are fundamental. Structural and fundamental changes, lots of changes happen. Not every change is structural. Many changes happen within the structure. So in a normal polity, election hogi, 4 saal baad, 5 saal baad, uske baad nai government aa jayegi. That is not a change. That's a change of government. But it is not a structural change. Right? In that context, a structural change would be कि आप एक democracy, elected government को हटा और आप एक authoritarian military ले. जब आप structural change. Right? So structural changes are changes that come about because of or by coming about cause. A change in the structure of things. दूसरी चीजें जिस तरह arrange हुई हैं. Structural change would be कि आपने इस कमरे की जो टेबलें हैं इसको उलट कर. इसका structure change. Right? A fundamental change, again I'm using those words very, very carefully. A fundamental change, by that I mean a change to meet my criteria would be a change that changes other things. Right? It becomes a fundamental change because it is not only a change unto itself, it is a change that changes a whole bunch of other things. One simple example would be when someone gets married. That becomes a fundamental change in many ways. Like one fundamental change that happens is your structure of relationships changes fundamentally. Not with one person, but with an entire array of people. Right? So again, I would like us to put my argument to the test, whether it is fundamental and structural. By the way, I'm putting these questions in the sense that I have to meet somehow these criteria. If so, yes. Right? The first question is the world changing? If so, are the changes structural and fundamental? If so, what might these changes mean for countries like Pakistan? In many ways, that is always the most interesting question. It is also the most important question. It is certainly the most difficult question, right? And I put this in particular for this talk because usually we are takers of ideas, not givers of ideas. Which means कि दुनिया में कुछ होता है फिर हम कहते हैं अच्छा ये तो हम अपने में try करें. And that is true, that is true not only for us as Pakistan, that is true for developing countries. That is a feature not of Pakistan, that is a feature of weak and strong, that is a feature of rich and poor, that is a feature of knowledge-based and not knowledge-based. So given where we are. So those are the three sort of things that I would like you to keep in mind. Is the world changing? If so, are those changes structural and fundamental? If so, what do they mean for Pakistan? And again, the caveat that I have suggested, this is totally new. This really is totally new. It builds on many things that I've been doing for many years that many of you have heard. Lekin in this framework, this is literally the first time I'm doing it. Let me put up a quote there, and I'm sorry that quotes are lambi quotes screen pe dalni nahi chahiye. Lekin it is worth it. वो काटने फाटने के बाद भी it's worth it. The last time I was here, and as I said, this is a continuation of that. I had talked about this work that I had done a year ago, talking to a lot of very smart people about what the world might look after the pandemic, or how the pandemic might change. Right. So in that period, I was sort of talking to a lot of people, reading a lot of things by a lot of smart people, and one of those things that I would like to share. This talk is not about COVID. This talk is not about COVID. My thinking on this is structured by that. So let me read out that quote. Civilization, both in the East and the West, was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations. It swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out. It overtook the dynasties of the time of their senility. It weakened their authority. The entire inhabited world changed. Right? Anyone wants to guess here? Kisne kaha? Kiss nahi pata? Marxist Marxist एक गालियां लेखन लिखते हैं जो है एक तो मार्क्सिस्ट है पहला 20 सवाल मर्द है क्या रहता है मर्द है 2 सवाल जिंदा है कि मुर्दा है. Anyone else? Anyone wants to guess? This is Abu Zaid al-Rahman ibn Khaldun, 1322-1406. In fact, if Machiavelli had thought about it, he would have said the same thing. Machiavelli, of course, as you know, comes soon after Ibn Khaldun. This is in the Muqaddimah, chapter 3. Now, I am, as some of you heard me talk before, I'm a big fan of Ibn Khaldun, and someday we should talk about why I'm a fan of Ibn Khaldun, but not for the reason that was a happenstance. There was something very special about it. The reason I put this quote, and the reason I put ek to sort of surprise element, but the real thing is Abdul Rahman Ibn Khaldun, and this is why I mentioned also Machiavelli, was Ibn Khaldun because there was the Great Plague. I would say Machiavelli was Machiavelli not because of the Great Plague, but for other reasons of disruption. And the questions that he was answering and trying to think about were the questions he was trying to think about, I would argue, because of the Great Plague. Usme plague ka taluk nahi, plague ka usse ye taluk tha ki he lost his parents in the plague. Plague ka usse ye taluk tha ki the politics of North Africa was in total disarray. That is what plagues, that is what change does. Wo plague ki wajah se nahi, bimari ki wajah se nahi. When a plague comes, when a virus comes, when a major disaster comes, when a great war comes, what it does is that it disrupts the normal model. Ghar pe koi mehman aata hai tabhi ye hota, right? Change aati hai, there are ways of doing things. World affairs are similar. Some big change comes, and those ways of doing things can no longer be continued. Therefore, SDPI and Abid have to invent something called hybrid. hybrid seminar, right? Someone has to invent कि जी मैंने mask पहना, right? So if you think about what change does is it forces you to make changes that may have happened already, but it changes the pace of that. जंग ये करती है, कहत ये करता है, plague ये करता है, pandemics ये करते हैं, they shake the system. And that was the world that Khaldun was talking about. The reason I put the Khaldun thing is, I am constantly reminded of how that world was very, very similar to the world of today. And in fact, how many worlds were. Some years ago, I think 5 साल पहले, 6 साल पहले, मैंने इसी कमरे में एक talk दी थी on world affairs and the rise of authoritarian leaders. In which I put up a slide there and argued, this is about 6 or 7 years ago in this room, and argued that the world today, if we needed to understand it, we needed to go back to something like 1913, 1914, 1912, right before the First World War. A number of people have said that since and before. More and more, I think the Khaldun world is the same, and the reason I mentioned that is not that Khaldun ke duniya mein koi खास बात थी या सभ्यता में भी कोई खास बात थी, but to argue that there are moments in history when world affairs shakes in a certain set of ways and a certain set of structural fundamental shifts come together that allow for a truly major change in the shape of the world, right? So that is the tamheed to the point that I'm making, that just like if you go and aap logon ne padha hai on the world he was talking about, the reason that he worked with about 8 different rulers in that time as an advisor was not just because he was so smart that they wanted to work with him, but rulers नहीं होता, वो एक के पास जाता था, उसको भी मार देता था, फिर इसको भी जेल में डाल देता था, दूसरा आता था कहता यार बंदा गलमंद है, इसको ले आओ जरा, इससे हम भी एडवाइस लेते हैं. It's a very interesting, fascinating sort of history of Machiavelli के साथ the same thing is happening. Right? If you think about the other sorts of people who are thinking at various points about the world changing in fundamental ways, Sun Tzu in China, Kautilya in Marela, right? If you think about when they are thinking about those things, there is a reason they think about it in times of upheaval. And I say this, and I'm taking too much time on this, but I say this to suggest that the upheaval is not as important very often as the things that are triggered by the upheaval. Because upheavals allow for change that would not happen. Again, to use a very simple argument, ये जो है ये Zoom जिस पे कुछ लोग हमें सुन रहे हैं, या जो online meetings हैं, या जो online teaching है, अच्छा है बुरा है, I have strong views on that. I'm sure you have strong views on that. There is nothing fundamentally COVID related about this. इससे पहले Skype हमारे पास पहले भी था. But something like COVID comes and a change that is going at 30 miles an hour turns into 100 miles an hour. And this is where that is important, that there are moments when things that are not believable become believable because of the nature of the upheaval. Again, अगर इसी कमरे में because of so many of our environmental friends, if we had said कि यार कुछ तरीका निकालते हैं कि सारे जहाज जो है ना 2 महीने के लिए बंद हो जाए ताकि emission कम हो जाए, he would have thrown that idea outside the area to possibly be. ये तो कुछ सोच नहीं सकते. And yet something like COVID comes and you do it in literally 24 hours, right? So that is the opportunity of these moments of upheaval. I've made too much of that. Let me come to my 5 points. And as I said, this is really for discussion rather than because I am still thinking. I have these five ideas where I think fundamental structure, the way that I define those 2 words, changes are happening. And the first of those is the one that Abid started us off with. And that is a fundamental shift in the nature of global balances of power. Where I would push back here is that's not about Ukraine. Ukraine is a footnote. The footnote doesn't mean it's not important. But what happens in Ukraine is a footnote in what is happening, I think, and many other people think, is happening much more fundamentally. Graham Allison is one of the people who has written about this in his book, The Thucydides Trap. And one of the things that we are seeing, my argument and other people's argument is that we are seeing again structural and fundamental shift in the nature of power, of main power, global power, superpower, just great powers. Not in the sense that we are moving out of a world defined for at least about just under a century by what was called Cold War dynamics to back to an earlier state of balance of power dynamics. Right. Now, again, for the IR people here, this is a significant difference, right? So, Cold War dynamics are dynamics as suggested, Henry Kissinger has which is in fact a very stable dynamic of power. And the argument that many people are making, that I certainly find convincing, is that Cold War is actually a fairly stable state. That we might historically remember the Cold War as the good old days, when a certain stability, that's not what I'm saying, but a certain global stability is set because there are two powers, because they define their spheres, and because those spheres are kept fairly stable, partly because of the bipolar nature, largely because of the nuclear deterrence effect, that something had come that was so overwhelmingly fearful, people were so overwhelmingly fearful of, that itself keeps the balance. Now, whether that is so or not, go Cold War khatam hoti hai, uske baad we have this moment of sort of supposed unipolarity. And we come out of it, and a lot of the discussions that you hear, including from people like me, but many in the literature and certainly in our everyday political discussions, seem to go back constantly to yearn for a Cold War. Right? So, आपका जो standard वो अखबार वाले का या टीवी वाले का है कि वो अब चाइना और अमेरिका की होगी, right? After Ukraine, रूस और अमेरिका की होगी. The assumption being कि as if the natural state of things is कि दो powers होंगी और उनके बीच में balance हो. The argument here by Graham Allison, I certainly find it compelling, is that we are not moving towards a Cold War type dynamic because it's very difficult to in fact achieve it, but in fact moving back to what has been very often the case, which is a multi-power, sphere of influence where every power is willing, able, and desirous of changing its space. Right. So again, that's why I put that picture of board game. But in that sense, where you have multiple players, no one is Gurini. And therefore, the alliances are also not permanent. Right? Now, again, this is not the time to go into it, but some of you who have heard me speak about this before, at least folks like me, therefore, suggest that you don't have to choose sides. In fact, it is not useful to choose sides. In a Cold War dynamic, you are pushed to choose sides. Right? So for those of us who are old enough, how did you know कि कौन सा मुल्क communist है? कौन सा वाला जर्मनी communist है या कौन सा वाला नॉर्थ कोरिया communist है जिसने मुल्क के नाम में डेमोक्रेटिक लिखा हुआ है? वो communist है. GDR कह रहा था. But there was a clear sense that it is not only that you wanted to, but you had to. This is a very different basis of an independent foreign policy than PHIO. But this goes back to a lot of your reading of history, whether it is in this part of the world or other parts of the world. I will put it there, but I would say that what that means is that, at least to me, what it implies is that there is a fundamental shift. And because we are all children of the Cold War, our constant attempt to think like Cold War is, at least in my view, not very useful, and B keeps backfiring. Now, again, this is not a commentary on world politics in that sense, but the Ukraine is very, very interesting because, in a way, agar aap world map there are kind of only two major leaders left who are children of the Cold War: Biden and Putin. And कई बार मुझे लगता है कि they are doing the last gasp. Putin was clearly born, bred, raised on the idea of Cold War, and a lot of his political impetus is return to the glory of the Soviet Union. And Biden, throughout his career, Cold War fighting. Right? So here we are in a moment when we have these two major leaders who, by the way, turned out to have frameworks that are very major, and they keep trying to push the world back towards that thinking. लेकिन इसका हम पे फिर implication क्या? इस पे हम पे I don't know. I'm trying to just raise ideas for you guys to clear apart. But if in fact I am at all true in this, then this question of आपने कौन सी side choose करनी है is not only the wrong question, it is a dangerous question. That is not an easy thing to do. A, because we are trained to choose sides. मैंने choose करना है मेरा चौधरी कौन और फिर मैंने उसके साथ जो उसको follow कर. The problem with that is here a conceptual one. It's not an ideological one. The conceptual one is that the Chaudhurys are going to keep changing. So, for example, again to use the Cold War analogy, because we are in this experiment over here in Ukraine. This discussion is Russia and China on the same side or not? Why is it a difficult question at this point? 50 years ago, it would not have been a difficult question. You would have thrown the cards and you would have known on this side. Even between Europe and US, once you open that box, those lines are not as clear. It is जिस तरह आपको पढ़ते हैं ना सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर में भी तक भी पढ़ते थे उससे पहले हमारी इंडिया की हिस्ट्री में तो बहुत ही पढ़ते थे कि एक जो बादशाह है वो आज इसकी साइड पे उनके खिलाफ लड़ रहा है कल वो उसकी साइड पे हो गया मेरे खिलाफ लड़ right so for example in the second world war first world war Russia starts the war on the side of the Germans ends the war on the side of the Allies and Americans. And even as the war is ending, becomes sort of Cold War. So in some ways, ये जो हम सवाल पूछते हैं कि जी बताओ किसकी साइड पे, वो सवाल ही गलत. That has other implications for us too. One of the implications that for people like me, and I assume many here at SDPI, the particularly practical one every day, is the breaking up of the multilateral system that we have also grown up with and are beneficiaries of. I hope I am wrong in this. Many people hope they are wrong in this. But we may be living through either the breaking up or the transformation of one of the great experiments of the last half century. Agar aapko first and second world war ke beech mein bhi dekhen, there's something called the League of Nations, very similar idea to the United Nations. And that needed to be dissolved before the Second World War started. Now, I'm not saying the Third World War started here because we can go into that. That's a different sort of thing. History really never repeats itself. History can repeat it. History doesn't repeat it. But to think of it repeat is, I don't think valid. But the breakup of the multilateral system is of the great significance to countries like us. So for many of us who grew up, including myself, sort of feeling very cute because we said कि हम बताते हैं UN में क्या गलती है हम सारे तकरीर करते थे UN ने ये नहीं किया UN ने इसके लिए ये नहीं किया UN ने in a way अब जब वो नहीं रह रहा है और I'm not saying वो नहीं रह रहा लेकिन it is not what it was ever meant to be. See the frailty. I don't want to say breakup because I'm not sure to get there. I'm not even sure whether it will. But in some ways, COVID was in fact a very, very real moment for the observer to see what has happened to the multilateral system. So, इस कमरे में हर शख्स, when I'm looking at Dr. Shah, whose experience is much more than me and others, even I would say in your experience.
I'm not that old.
Thanks. But experience old. But even in your case, I think, with all your experience, this was probably the most global crisis of our lifetime, certainly for most of us. Global in the sense कि एक ऐसी crisis है which is truly global, which is not contained, which affects everyone in similar ways. So in our lifetime, until sort of climate becomes an even bigger crisis, this was the single most global crisis of our lifetime. What happens as a response to the global crisis? The first casualty of one of the biggest early casualties of COVID is the multilateral system. आखिरी बार हम में से किसने WHO के हेड को टीवी पे देखा? I can tell you many of them. जिंदगी की सबसे बड़ी health crisis आती है मैंने देखा था जिस दिन that famous press conference when he comes and declares that this is now a global crisis. Right? 10 मिनट उसके बाद हर मुल्क ने कहा मास्क बांधो, दरवाजा बंद करो, मेरा मास्क तेरे पास नहीं. Right? I mean, if you even think about the physicality of it, I understand mask डालना दिया, I understand airport बंद करो, but the physicality of it was close down everything on the border. Those who go to like China or Hong Kong or Singapore or New Zealand, उन्होंने कहा हम zero पे जा रहे हैं, बिल्कुल बंद कर. Right? I'm not saying वो गलत है या सही है, but what I'm saying is that the physicality of that action और मैं और आप, मैंने आदमी नहीं मिला. But apart from this, in very real ways, the one crisis that should have immediately created a global response. आपकी पहले वैक्सीन डिस्टेंस हुई, फिर आपकी वैक्सीन अपार्टाइड हुई, अब आपकी वैक्सीन डेथ और रिकॉन्सी हो. So in some, and this is not just America, the first place where in Europe where COVID becomes a serious issue is Italy. Right? Remember March 12, तो वो इटली में हमें खबरें आनी शुरू. The very first thing that happens within the EU, the most structurally stable part of the multilateral experiment, is not just the closing down of borders, but Germany, the most European of the Europeans, saying to Italy, मैं आपको वेंटिलेटर नहीं दे सकता, मैं आपको मास्क नहीं दे सकता. अब तो मास्क को हर एक जेब में रखता है ना, मेरी किसमें. But remember at one point the question was, do we have enough masks or not? I remember I was on CNN and I said this thing, I never thought I would see a time when countries would worry more about how many masks they have rather than how many weapons they have. But there was a moment like that. And Germany is saying to Italy at that moment, no ventilator, no mask, no help for you. इसलिए नहीं कि मेरे पास ये आ गया, but ये आ सकता है. I cannot spare them right now. Right now that changed. It opened up and so on and so forth. But the point I'm trying to make is, this is again part of this power shift. So the reason I'm taking time on this is to say, yes, powers shift all the time. Powers change. Soviet Union ऊपर जाता था, कभी नीचे आता था. Right before they sent someone to space, people thought US जीत रहा है. Once they sent to space, पूरा US जो है वो डर गया कि now they will take over. And that is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, I think people think, and I agree, that there is a fundamental shift in the global power structure, which is moving from uni or bipolar to multipolar, shifting alliances. And the point about multilateral is the point actually about that, because in those shifting alliances, the structure, architecture of these multilateral institutions will either need a new logic. And this is not just happening with COVID or with health, but it's happening with a whole bunch of issues, things we work on, climate. I have for a long time stopped going to the COPs, but it is not simply कि वो climate पे push नहीं कर. It is that again and again, people's faith and hope in multilateral institutions to solve things has gone down. I would argue कि इसमें खुश होने वाली बात नहीं. It is not good for weak countries, because a strong multilateral system is better for developing countries, even if it doesn't always meet their interests, because it gives them a forum for cooperation and so on and so forth. Taking too much time on that, but I hope you get the sense of where I'm going with this, because this is, to me, not just that. The second one, and इस पे मैं बहुत बोल सकता हूँ, so मैं नहीं बोलूँगा. I hope I will contain myself. This obviously you expect from anything that I talk about, climate. But this is probably the most radical thing I will say. This is, when I say that climate is a fundamental shift, I'm not just saying that climate change. ये हमें पता. In fact, हमें इतना पता है कि हम सब ने अपने नारे तैयार कर लिए. वो तकरीबन जो है ना, वो दीन की तरह हो गया. हम अच्छी बातें करते हैं without believing in them about religion. Now we do it about climate. Everyone has, पहले सिर्फ मेरे पास presentation होती थी, अब हर एक के पास 10 मिनट में निकाल सकते. 10 मिनट में exactly बता सकते, and right at a moment when climate is in fact an existential change. When climate impacts hit as they are hitting, we will not have the excuse that we did not know. And this is what I've been talking about here and other places in what I call the age of adaptation. Now, why am I saying this is a structural shift? One type of structural shift is just a very sort of science-based, carbon-based, clear shift that we are in the age of adaptation. At least the Bharat presentation of my SDPI on this idea that we are in the age of adaptation. You read the new IPCC report, it is saying the same. What does the age of adaptation mean? The age of adaptation means climate change is no longer a future issue. Right? We still talk about it as if it's a future issue. If it is no longer a future issue, then it is no longer just a mitigation issue. If it is no longer a mitigation issue, then it is an issue of impacts. If it is an issue of impacts, then the questions of climate justice come to the fore, which we are not interested in. In some ways, we have constructed a vocabulary, by we I mean in developing countries, which still talks about it as if it's a common global issue. It is no longer a common global issue. And that is why I put that picture rather than the picture of some graph. That in some ways, to me, the great surprise is how quiet not just developing country governments, but climate activists in developing countries are on the impacts. अगर कोई बोलता है वो बल्कि बेचारी ग्रेटा बोलती है. In some ways, we are still कि मैं खिड़की ठीक कर लूँगा, I do my mitigation. I'll go to COP and maybe get another little money for some conference, some program. In many ways, what people like Anil Agarwal, before him, Dr. Mehboob Haq had been talking about, we are in the 50th year of anniversary of Stockholm. People forget Stockholm conference in 1972. Developing countries had, led by people like Mehboob Haq, who was not in government then, it was an intellectual movement. Developing countries had not only threatened, but it was very likely they were going to boycott it. They did not want to come to the conference. Because the 1972 conference was the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. And the developing country argument, again by Mehboob Haq and Begdad Desai and others, the argument was this is not our issue. Which is not to say that environment is our issue, but where are people? Right? Stockholm Conference, there were two people आए थे. Unfortunately, two heads of states आए थे. Unfortunately, both were later killed. One was Indira Gandhi of India, the other was Olof Palme of the host country. Indira Gandhi's most famous statement was, poverty is the worst form of pollution. It's one of those defining ideas about how developing countries look. Her own Ministry of Environment then sent out a press release, this is a mistake. In fact, it wasn't a mistake. Dr. Swaminathan had written that for her. But this struggle between the role of poverty and development in climate, in many ways, I would say has been lost. And as a developing country myself, I blame myself. And we are at a moment, I am quite confident that, and that's the structural change. In some ways, the movement, for example, of net zero, right? I am not a fan of net zero. I think it's going to come back and bite us. It sounds like a great, why wouldn't you want net zero? So my city, Boston, we are building a new building for my school. The dean of the school, we are building a new building, and the building I'm built current, it doesn't have a basement. It's 17 floors high. All of the electrical and other sort of material are going to be on the 3rd floor. Right? Partly because I have internalized the fact that climate is going to change, adaptation is going to happen. I am in Boston, I can pay for it. And I'm going to, so I'm not preparing for a world where climate has been solved, nor are you. Nor is Tesla, right? What's the problem? What is the potential problem with net zero? I think they're very nice people. They're very, very nice people. But the implication of the net zero policy is that Boston will become net zero. And then they will point at you and say, right? And that is a question of where the molecule comes from and where the molecule goes and where it impacts, right? So not just the politics, but the science of impact is different from the science of mitigation. The mitigation question is, how do you manage the carbon molecule to reduce the likelihood of potential climate change? The adaptation question is not about the climate molecule at all. Adaptation carbon molecule पे नहीं होती, adaptation तो water molecule पे होती, right? And that is a very differential work. So to me, the fundamental shift is not simply that we now know that climate impacts are happening. मैं जब आया था अभी last December आया था इस weekend पे, I have 2 sweaters in my bag. I grew up in Islamabad. I thought मैं Mars में जा रहा हूँ. I don't think that's about climate change necessarily, but at least what I'm getting at is that we are in the age of adaptation, and in the age of adaptation, both the policy and the politics shifts fundamentally. I would argue that in some ways, when I'm now old enough, when I sort of started 1992 around Rio, there was this north-south. And there was this sense that there is a different climate interests in different countries. And out of that came very real legal instruments, common but differentiated. Debt. Who killed it? We killed it. जब आपने 20 साल से बोला ही नहीं उसके बारे में, right? What you got on the negotiating table, common but differentiated. आखिरी बार मुझे जरा बताइए, when was it seriously? Additionality principle. 3 years of negotiation. Right? Developing countries go and celebrate कि हमने बड़ी एक तीर मारा. Additionality principle, if it was applied in the legal context in which it was agreed to, who can it be done? So the point I'm trying to make here is that if there is a fundamental and structural shift in the climate debate, it is not simply that we are going to be talking as we already are about impacts. It is also that the climate politics changes. अगर आप मुझे एक इजाज़त दें, let me, मैंने ये डालनी नहीं थी, I've shown it a few times, but let me show it again. We all talk about, especially COVID के context में, 2020 was a year like no other. This to me is my favorite slide on what I mean by age of adaptation. Right? Those are these हम कहते हैं बड़ा फर्क साथ. Let me tell you how other ways वो फर्क है. I have now stopped ever using any future year in any climate presentation. So as a rule, मैंने policy बना ली है कि मेरी कुछ ही slide में 20, 30, 40, 50 years, because it causes this sense कि अच्छा भी बड़ा time. Right? So here is what 2020 was like. Here is what 2020 was like. January 2020, hottest January ever. ये आपके अखबारों से, this is sort of things that all of you have seen. February, second hottest February ever recorded since there was a record. March, second hottest March. April, second hottest April. इस वक्त तक हमें आदत पड़ गई. आप इस वक्त जो है ना, इमरान भी ट्वीट नहीं करता. यार ऐसे आर्मी नहीं आ गए. Right? The issue was over. May, hottest May ever. June, hottest June ever. July, second hottest July ever. August, second hottest ever. Now you see the pattern. Instead of December में जाके में थोड़ा सा मिला, November was hottest November ever. December was 8th hottest. Nearly all of these were broken in 2021. That's the point I'm making. The age of adaptation, the evidence is so clear. I don't need to prove to you anymore. But the point I'm making about the fundamental shift is the fundamental shift in the discussion, both policy and politics on climate. My sense is, and I think it won't be a bad thing, that we are going to see more and more for those of us who work on climate, more, not necessarily a clash, a debate, because there are people in the North who would be very, very conducive to the argument, but we in the developing world who are now the front line in adaptation, the difference is that mitigation world में हम कुछ कर नहीं सकते, right? आपके zero भी कर देंगे तो क्या हो जाएगा? ठीक है, करना चाहिए जो कर सकते हैं, लेकिन we couldn't make a leverage a change. In the adaptation, in the world of adaptation, you are the front line, and therefore the responsibility of changing that debate lies on us. My most interesting of my five, and I'll try to is this one. Is this one. आप में से किसी ने कंप्यूटर खोला? Anyone? अगर खोला हुआ है या नहीं खोला हुआ है, अगर खोला हुआ है, I really want to do an experiment. किसी के पास इंटरनेट, गूगल पे जाइए या लिखिए वर्क, और वर्क के साथ इमेजेस खोलिए, and just tell us what you find. I want to see कि आपके कंप्यूटर पे वही आता है जो मेरे कंप्यूटर पे आता है. क्या तस्वीर है? Anyone? I tell क्या तस्वीर है बताइए? ऑफिस वर्क किस किस्म की, कौन है? और अगर मर्द है उसके सामने क्या है? लैपटॉप पे बैठे हुए मोस्ट. मैंने ये आज सुबह कोशिश की. Anyone else? आपके पे भी ये यार? This is very interesting. This is, I mean, Google is not science, but it is very indicative of the world we look at. I was making the slide. I wanted pictures of workers. I put in work. It took me 3 pages to get to an image of someone who actually works with their hands. All the pictures were of people like you. And that is the fundamental shift that is happening. If you live in the US as I do, this is the single biggest political issue. More than Black Lives Matter, more than anything else right now, I think. My argument has been, and this one at least is not coming, this truly is my argument. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but I feel like I am. We have created, particularly hastened by climate, by COVID. So work is shifting. Change here, the nature of work is shifting. Work has again become a bad thing. Work has become something to fight. So एक तो उसकी एक societal work. अगर आप सोचें कि work ही इंसान की जिंदगी में वक्त क्या होती है, what are some of the most common questions you ask someone when you meet them the first time? आप किसी को मिलते हैं, आपसे क्या कहते हैं? आप नाम उठा के देख लीजिए, किसी का नाम स्मिथ है, किसी का नाम कारपेंटर है, आप अपने नाम उठा के देखिए. पूरी दुनिया में ऐसा, right? Work as a source of identity, right? This library is written about this, has been a fundamental feature of personal dignity. Right? It's also been a fundamental feature of control. Chaudhary, just to say Chaudhary as a word has meaning. It's not just who is right? So that has been changing for a while. As work changed, you know, carpenter, किसी का अगर last name है तो carpenter जो है वो क्या बनाता है? Table बनाता है, right? So people who think about this are really thinking about table तो कोई भी नहीं बनाता. एक शख्स है जो 1 लाख बनाता है उस टेबल, और अब वो भी नहीं बनाता है, वो एक रोबोट बनाता है, right? Partly it was the bifurcation of work, but that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is that between what I'll come to later, AI, between the changes in the workplace, between ideas of universal basic income and so on and so forth, the idea of work has fundamentally changed. And it is not about young and old. Young and old surface, there are people who are coming into that world now. And they find the workplace to be an evil thing, as opposed to be a defining thing that says, this is who I am. हम मजाक करते हैं कि लोग बच्चों से कहते हैं तू बड़े होकर क्या बने. But it wasn't just about, it's not just about कि हमने उसकी कोई पढ़ाई का फैसला करना. It is about putting meaning in life. Right? So if you think about the fundamental questions people all over the world and all over time have asked each other is, aap kahan se ho? How are you? Which is a development question. Principal development question is how are you? The principal identity question is where are you from? Right? Now that has a whole bunch of things, but the reason I was looking for this picture, the reason I went on that Google page, I wanted to see कि मेरे computer का तो नहीं था कि मेरी searches की वजह से वैसे आ रहा, is actually much bigger than what I've just said. And what that is, that we are in the process all across the world, including here, and all of us in this room are on one side of this debate. So all of us are biased. We are seeing the creation of a new major divide amongst people. class divide. So class divide क्या होता है? Class divide होता है उसके coal miner क्योंकि वो गरीब है और जो उसका सेठ है क्योंकि वो अमीर है. The class divide that we have seen accelerated in these times of COVID, I go back to the is the class divide of people who work on screens versus people who work with their hands. And particularly if you are in Europe or US, this is dramatically clear. It is between people who will work from home and people who will not work. And that divide is becoming clear in every society. Frontline worker. But if you think about what has been happening in the last 2 years, unlike what happens, for example, in wars, right? You send people to take risks for you. They come back and you give them some reward. America में GI bill आया, college education हुई, health change हुई, suburbs आए. A lot of it was happening because all these soldiers were coming. Here you go through a crisis and the reward, to the extent there is a reward, are for people who are not frontline. So जो restaurant में आप सबके virus का frontline receiver था, आपने तो फैसला किया ना आप कब जाएंगे नहीं जाएंगे, मास्क पहनेंगे नहीं पहनेंगे. वो जो बेचारी है बेचारा सर्व कर रहा है. I'm again talking in a more US sector, but I think it's equally true there. They, because the structure of their work, do not have that. And in like in everything else, when great societal shifts happen, there is a redistribution of resources. In this case, those resources include just work from home. And आप किसी इदारे को उठा के देख लें, less here but more there, and you see it in many ways here too. And what you see is those who have a choice versus those who don't have a choice. And that becomes very much a digital shift. Now, how does this impact Pakistan? It impacts Pakistan in many ways. For example, my friend Umar Saif and others get very excited about the gig economy, right? Which is, if you unpack it, is essentially not very dissimilar from what was happening about 15, 20 years ago with phone call center, right? And therefore, it is a transition move, and it will become an even more transition move. But the point I'm trying to make here is, keep an eye on this. If I am right, we will hear more and more about the changing nature of the workplace. And we see this as the identity wars we see already all over the world. But work itself becomes, once you take away its identity mode, and it simply becomes a production mode, right? Because what you carpenter wali kahani, it's not a, it's sort of a baaton karno ki nahi hai. If I put my name, I make my name carpenter because I have a sense of pride for the table I built. अभी भी आप म्यूजियम में जाएंगे, अपने घरों में भी चले जाएं, पुरानी टेबल के नीचे जिस कारीगर है उसका नाम लिखा हो. Right? There is a sense of achievement. I'm making it poetic, but it's not just that. It's true in everything. आप अगर फैसलाबाद चले जाएं घंटा घर पे और उसके 12 बाजार देखें, उनका एक नाम है. There is a sense कि मेरी शनाख्त जो है वो मेरे हुनर के साथ. उसका सिर्फ ताल्लुक गरीब अमीर से नहीं है. उसका sense of purpose in life से. Now, over the last 50, 60 years, this is other people talking, we have taken work and segmentized it in such a way that in fact, there are very few things in which you can take ownership of what you did. I would say the people in this room are in the minority. कि कभी कोई पर्चा लिखता है तो वो उस पे लिख सकता है Abid Suleri में. And वो भी अब कम से कम. Right? Because that process of, if you will, call it not industrialization, but the segmentization of work sort of robs this away. So those are the type of things that people are now going to talk about. And I would argue that work becomes an important part of that. It becomes a particularly important part of that for Pakistan and countries like us, because we will be at the receiving end of that change, as we will, and an extremely young population. Again, I need to think more about this, but more and more it strikes me. Okay, this is one of those fault lines that we are seeing. As I begin to wrap up, there's one more to go. I really struggled with this one. पहले मैंने इसको information का. फिर मैंने इंटेलिजेंस कहा, लेकिन इंटेलिजेंस पाकिस्तान में क्या ना वैसे खतरे से खाली and I don't know what to call it. I was going to call it AI. For a long time, I have been not a skeptic of AI, but I've been a skeptic of those fantastical views machines will take over and so on and so forth. Until recently, I've been spending time with and meeting, and after reading a lot from a number of people, in particular this person called Max Tegman. Max Tegman is a professor at MIT. One of his more famous books is called Life 3.0. Now, this is a very smart, thoughtful person. But for the first time, he started sort of sounding convincing that there is something changing, and something has already changed in terms of intelligence in machines. And it is not about कि machines जो हैं वो एक दिन convention करेंगी सारी मिलके कहेंगी अच्छा यार इनको हटाते हैं हमारे. But where we are going, we are giving more and more influence because machines are much better than us at dealing with information. So the great new discovery of, and that is why I put that picture, is the quantity of information. And we are now, as a species, according to him, and I find that convincing, I'm still somewhat skeptical, are at a stage where our ability to process information and churn it into knowledge is being outweighed. Right? So usually the people who talk about AI give these two big moments. One was the Big Blue. Big Blue was the IBM program that beat the chess. लेकिन उससे ज़्यादा वो जो Chinese game होती है Go. Right? When the machine started beating humans at Go, that was the wow moment. I don't know if people know Go is about 100 times more complex than chess in terms of number of possibilities and number of moves, but more than that, the role of intuition in the move. Right? And what people are talking about is, one is an educational challenge, that the great production of our generation is information. इस डेढ़ घंटे में SDPI is going to throw out more information than I would argue SDPI created in maybe its first year. Right? एक बाप के साथ की उसके बाद उसको YouTube पे डाला. उसको बाद उन्होंने मुझे पहले बता दिया कि हमें Twitter पे आपका कुछ चाहिए. Right? So what SDPI is doing is, it is producing artifacts of information, throwing it out. And when I say I think in terms of just information, units of information, the amount that just an event attempt SDPI will produce will be far more than it was in a much longer period of time. Now you imagine what is happening all over. Now you imagine your and my ability to churn information into knowledge, which was the great skill that we as humans had. Right? Now we come to sort of the Max Tegman argument, which is that the superiority of machine is not but the ability that it now has to transform information into knowledge, and that knowledge is called into actions by real people. So I personally found this and again, I apologize, I know I'm treading into very unknown territory this time. I'm very humility ke saath kar raha hu. But my personal first time of understanding was, I think that when I last iPhone liya, I don't know if this happens with you or not. I got an iPhone, उससे पहले भी iPhone था, ये पता नहीं इसमें कौन सी चीज change हुई थी. I get, a week into the iPhone, I get into my car in the morning to go to office. और मैंने वो साथ अपने iPhone रखा, मेरी 40 मिनट की ड्राइव. And suddenly the screen lights up and says, expected time 52 minutes, heavy traffic. And I remember मैं reverse कर रहा था, reverse करते करते I just stopped. And I said, मैंने तो कोई ऐसी चीज नहीं की जिससे इस मशीन को पता है कि मैं डर जाता. और ना मैंने कहीं कहा है कि अभी मुझे तुम बताओ कुछ. एक तो होता है ना कि आपने गए, आपने Siri से पूछा, it wasn't anything like that. I assume this happens on your phones now all the time. And the intelligence that after 10 minutes I realized कि pretty simple सी बात है, समझ आ गई मुझे. वो जो है उसको हफ्ता हो गया है, हर रोज वो देखता है कि ये जो बेवकूफ बंदा है ये सुबह सुबह उठता है, अलग सुबह उठता है, चल पड़ता है इसी तरफ. उसने देखा कि 5 दिन रोज ही उधर जाता है. It is a fair assumption to make कि आज भी उधर जाता है. Right, so once you start thinking about it, आपके मेरे जैसा कोई शख्स है, उसने जब इसको लिखा है, उसने उसको प्रूव किया, and now you expand this into multiple things. My second sort of thought when I started really buying into Tegman, and that was the first time when I sent him a message and said, "I want to meet you," was a program with a Waze. People use Waze, just not Google Map होता है उसका. Anyone knows? Anyway, Google Map की बात है. आपने कहीं रास्ता जाना है. So I know that it is now available here, though I imagine शायद वहाँ ज़्यादा use होता हो सड़कों का. But anyhow, Waze is you find a place to go to. And I would use Waze a lot to किसी के आपने जाना है जहाँ आपको रास्ता नहीं. And true story. And this was literally when I sort of then went back and wrote an email to him, I need to meet you and understand some of this. I got on the highway, I was going to some place, traffic was heavy, I put it into Waze, I got into a side street. Waze का कमाल सिर्फ ये, I think अब Google ने खरीद लिया, कि it bases its directions on how, what is happening to other drivers in the area. तो हर ड्राइवर जो इसके SDPI के पास है, उसका भी सिग्नल मिल जाएगा, उससे वो कहेगा अच्छा इधर मुड़ जाओ तो वहाँ ज़्यादा लोग. Right, so it's more intelligent than just saying इस point से उस point तक shortest distance gap. Both are just mathematical algorithms. Like, here's what happened. I go into this, I go into Waze, and Waze takes me to a side street. And then it asks me to turn again and then turn again. Chocolate turn के बाद I realized, यहाँ तो मैं अभी पहले तक पहुँच गया. And I keep following Waze, and I realized वो उसने मुझे 2 बार के बाद निकाल दिया. It was literally taking me like this. Right? This is both the limit of the intelligence, but also the danger of the intelligence. Because this is a perfectly fine machine, perfectly smart machine, जिसको बताया गया है कि make a change in your directions every microsecond based on the intelligence you have, which is different from how you and I as humans use our intelligence. Again, Max Tegman talks about मैं गलत side पे निकल गया, so I don't want you to believe that ऐसे machines are going to take over. But the point he's making is that the world is changing in very significant ways. Then we should be preparing for a world where more and more of our decisions are taken over. I know this. The young old wali baat hai, lekin not generational in that sense. Ability to read maps changes. Ability to read changes. The quantity of reading doesn't change. My son reads probably more than me. He reads it in 2 lines. He writes more than me. Right? That mode changes. Now, I'm not saying वो अच्छा है कि बुरा है. That's always changed. My grandfather used to think कि अगर कोई ballpoint pen से लिखेगा तो उसकी आदत खराब हो जाएगी. But I survived with a ballpoint pen. So these are changes like that. But what they're talking about is that the quantum of decisions that society starts leaving to more intelligent machines has societal implications, including on what we were talking about work earlier, including on issues of equity and justice, including on turning intelligence, in this case information, into a source of power and wealth. Just because I hope I'm amongst friends by my other Max ki kitab mein se best example hai. He tries to explain how machines can take over decisions that you never asked them to make. So he says कि imagine कि आपने machine, वो कहता है machine तो कोई भी चीज़ है ना, एक चूहे मारने वाले को क्या कहते हैं, mouse trap, हाँ, चूहेदानी whatever, mouse trap, right? So he says the mouse trap, you invent a mouse trap to catch a mouse. लेकिन अगर मेरा उसमें अंगूठा आ जाए, तो mouse trap तो ये पता है कि जब कुछ आए तो आप मार लो. That's the intelligence. उसको intelligence ये नहीं है कि वो mouse है या आपका अंगूठा है. All of these things are machine, चाहे वो computer हो चाहे वो mouse trap. So the mousetrap is programmed to go and hit. He says now, let us assume a very simple program which any sort of second year graduate can write, which is you devise a game or a program whose job is कि इस जगह से sheep जो है, जो भेड़ें, उनको आपने उस जगह तक ले जाना है through whatever hurdles are there. And you're going to find And the only programming goal that you have given the machine, machines have goals, is to take the sheep from here to there safely. Again, imagine this on large system. It says now, if for some reason in the middle there is a place where every time you go there, it blows up. The machine, being intelligent, will come to the conclusion, okay, I must not go from there. If that is the only way you to go, the machine has now reprogrammed itself from the goal of taking sheep from point A to point B to the goal of self-preservation. Right? Because the machine has rightly come to the logical conclusion that अगर मैं नहीं रहूंगी तो sheep तो जा ही नहीं सकती. आपने उसको कहीं नहीं कहा था कि आपने self-preserve करना. Right? So anyhow, the point I'm trying to make is that intelligence and the amount of intelligent decisions that are being given to machines have an implication. That implication is not just at this point about machines taking over or not, but that implication has implications on the type of decisions that we make and we outsource. And that has an implication on education and so on and so forth. Last and the most difficult one, and then I stop, is this thing which comes, I think the most articulate champion of what is happening on this is Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama, many people know from End of History, but I think we are unfair on him because the title was more interesting than the argument. The argument was more interesting than the title, like the title of the book. And there is something fundamentally shifting in democracy. Now, so this has got nothing to do with Pakistan, but I think in Pakistan politics here also see. The argument being made is not about a democracy. Actually, again, when we think about democracy and democracy has changed, then the immediate thing is अच्छा एक चीज democracy और दूसरी चीज जो है वो military or democracy. That's not what these folks are worried about. What they're worried about is that because of the other changes we talked about, including particularly information, the current modes of democracy are no longer sufficient for the demand for democracy. So usually the democratic debate is that kuch log ko democracy chahiye aur kuch ko nahi chahiye. That's not what they're talking about. That our tools of democracy are no longer fit for purpose for the democracy that is being demanded. Right? In a way, I think जो आज पाकिस्तान में हो रहा है, that is also part of that. लेकिन let me ask this, in a conceptual, theoretical way, because this is extremely important. Now, a lot of folks in Fukuyama Dusre got into this real question. I think in the period starting from the Arab Spring, which is why I put this picture, to especially Donald Trump. A whole set of issues, right? We saw the rise of this special type of politician, sort of populist, power projecting power to Saruki and so on and so forth. But then also sort of the use of social media, abuse of social media, abuse of information, all of these things. But at the fundamental structural level, that what we are talking about, what they are saying, we are seeing a shift in is, again, this thing that tools inappropriate for the demand. Demand coming in. It's not that people don't want democracy. Lekin the way we deliver democracy is no longer matching. What does that mean? When are elections held? Election कितनी देर बाद? 5 years. और anyone? अगर मैं सवाल पूछ रहा हूँ, obviously मैं obvious वाला नहीं हूँ. 3.5 साल बाद होते हैं हमारे. The argument that Frank Fukuyama would make, or I would make, is that is in fact not true anymore, especially including Pakistan. Actually, 3 घंटे बाद. In a very real, actual way. आप एक statement देते हैं, मैं उसको like करता हूँ, आप उसको retweet करते हैं. मैं उन retweets को देख के अपनी action को change करता हूँ. Right? If you think about the mechanics of the electoral process as the democratic process, it was that the will of the people will speak. I will take that will of the people, formulate a government. It's not just about power. And I will act on the basis of the will that gave me that power. In an ideal theoretical, लेकिन वैसे भी बात में कि एक आपकी गवर्नमेंट बनी, आपको लोगों ने वोट दिया, आपने फैसला किया कि मुझे लोगों ने इसलिए वोट दिया, करप्शन खत्म करने के लिए, जिसलिए नहीं दिया, इसलिए मैं वो काम करूंगा। और आपके पास 3 साल का, 4 साल का, 5 साल का एक प्रोसेस था जिसमें you put it. Now what is happening is none of us is patient. I'm not saying ये अच्छी बात है, ये बुरी बात है. This is a question of the tools we have. Right? This is a question of the tools by which we can vote, where our vote is heard. And so people of my generation, बुढ़े शुड्ढे जो है मेरी किस्म के, वो उनको गुस्सा चढ़ता है, patient. But that's the reality we have. There is an electoral mechanism, and the politicians all across the world are in fact right in reacting to it in real time. Right? Wouldn't it be great if अगर आप theoretically सोचे कितनी अच्छी बात है कि politician को एकदम पता लग जाए कि आप क्या चाह रहे हैं और वो उस पे एकदम अपना एक्शन चेंज करते हैं. The problem that Fukuyama and others and I have with this is not with whatever, but the problem that comes with this is that it also creates a certain type of politics, and what that means is that you should then expect the politics you're getting around the world. That it is not कि suddenly populist leader आ गए. Populism तो इस जो मैंने अभी process समझाया है उसका logical conclusion that people are in fact wanting populist leaders. It also changes the power. आपके जो Abid and other will go and शाम को 6 बजे 7 बजे they will say something and सुबह तक जो है. That is the time window in which somehow things have to react. So some minister has to come and say these Qaiyum. And the point that is being made here is that democracy, there is in fact a greater desire for democracy even in autocratic societies. Because we have the ability to speak and the ability to be heard. And we have not yet come across the means in which to match that and balance that. And the so-called dysfunctional politics, as Frank would have it, is not in fact dysfunctional. It is a result of the tools as well as the desires of people, even those people who then think the result is dysfunctional. जब आपने वो बारी-बारी उसको वोट करना है रीट्वीट से या लाइक से या अपने मैसेज से, आप इसीलिए करना ना कि we always said that my politicians should listen. In fact, what we are seeing, according to them, this is a very, very interesting finding, if true, is politicians are listening. And therefore, they are reacting in immediate time because they do want you to keep liking it and so on and so forth. Right? So those are the 5 sort of, and I can apologize, मैं पहली बार ये वाली बातें कर रहा हूँ, and it is new for me, so it is still raw and my arguments haven't fully gelled. But those, I would argue, are 5 things in which the world is changing. And it is changing in fundamental ways. Fundamental means that it changes the structures that we will have, it changes the fundamental design of the world that we are in. Let me stop there. Thank you for your patience and thank you for all this tolerance.
Thank you, Abid, for this very elaborative discussion. I know हम question answers के लिए थोड़ा सा time over हो गया, लेकिन discussion इतनी interesting थी.
My apologies.
I never wanted to. It was very very interesting discussion, I must say. और क्योंकि 5 ideas नए थे, introducing them, and so of course you were able to capture the audience for 1.5 hours. Right. So now without ado, let's come to question answers. हमारे पास कुछ ऑनलाइन क्वेश्चन भी है, पहले मैं वो ले लूँ, वो बहुत पेशेंट से लोग हमें सुन रहे थे, जरा उनको देख लो उसके बाद में यहाँ का. और अगर जो SDPI टीम है, आदिल के लिए एक गर्म कप चाय का होगा. पहले है जी को सैयद शुजात अहमद साहब है. Different components and ingredients which led to growth as well. In current scenario, what is causing what and who should we look at for the first?
Can we take a few questions?
Second is about the nature of education is changing. हायर एजुकेशन उसके मतलब पूछ रहे हैं, उनको 2 क्वेश्चन हम यहाँ से ले लेते हैं। जी आप।
Okay, I'll take a little more time because I came from the PHF and the purpose for coming here was that I heard your last talk, the SDPI organized to the, I think, December. So it was very interesting, but that actually compared me. Dr. Adil, I have 2 or 3 things from you related to your question. The first question is the world is really changing, and is it the structure of fundamental change and how it is impact Pakistan? Yes, the world is changing, and it is actually the structure and the fundamental change that is happening, and there is a lot of implications for Pakistan as well. And the point that you are making related to the depth of the multilateralism, yes, that multilateralism dead quite a years ago, but I think this COVID provided an opportunity to this multilateralism and the collectivism to awake itself from the many forms. So I will say it is the awakeness of the collectivism, because the whole world was stuck on the one crisis, that was a global crisis, and that was a global pandemic, but all the worlds get together to resolve that global pandemic. Though it was a time taking, though everybody came up with their own intentions, like हरे को अपने आप की मर्जी, हम अपने आप को बचाने पहले अपने बॉर्डर में फ्रीज कर ले, हमारे पास ना आए, लेकिन the whole world was on the one point that we have to fight with this pandemic collectively. And it was the answer of that things, yes, that the pandemic provided an opportunity for entire world to come up with a solution. और फिर उस vaccine के ऊपर भी politics हुई, that is another debate. I'm not going to do that. Then जब आपने work की बात की, and yes, this pandemic brings lots of economical and political pressures at a different level to the world. The economical crisis was huge, yes. The globalization and the digitalization was very on the peak, like it was a very much prominent everywhere. Digitalization की जो market था, उसका boom था. Toward the pandemic से पहले भी वो था. But उन्होंने एक business model भी shift किया, लेकिन उस digitalization ने बहुत सारे लोगों को lay off किया है. अगर हम कहते हैं कि कोविड के बाद वर्ल्ड नॉर्मल में आ जाएगी, that is not the, उसको नॉर्मल आने में भी बड़ा टाइम लगेगा, because when you are talking about the carpenter, I am the witness of that trash picker कि जब पूरी मार्केट बंद थी, वो कहीं से trash नहीं pick कर सकता था जिसको वो sell कर सके. So there are a number of the challenges that pandemic also brought into us. So that was the thing. पाकिस्तान के लिए इसकी implication बहुत ज़्यादा है. अभी आप अगर देखें, आपने multipolar world, yes, it is a very multipolar world. US या रशिया जितना भी करे इसको bipolar में लाने के, it's not, it's out of control now. China is another emerging power. You have the Central Asian states, you have the Europe now. One Belt, One Road was a very big initiative that the China was taking. आप पिछले 3-4 साल से देखें, जैसे pandemic की बात देखें, वो सारी चीजें back burner पर चली गई हैं. So there are a number of the things. World कभी भी उस bipolar में नहीं जा सकती, and now it is a time that the world leader also have to think that how they will set the global norm, because COVID ने बहुत सारी चीजों पे break किया है. अभी आप critical scenario देखें सिर्फ पाकिस्तान में, सबसे बड़ा breaker कौन है politics को destroy करने में, democracy को? आपको social media. Sorry, let me complete. Your social media, yeah, it's the social media that's changing the norm. So how do you see that the political movements that are emerging in Pakistan, especially the Aurat March movement, that's another emerging movement in Pakistan. So these social media kind of the accountability के social tools है, how they are changing the global norms. You can see that कोई भी चीज हो, world leaders के ऊपर ये चीज affect कर रही है, these social accountability tools. और UN में भी यूं अपना बहुत कम. So these are some of the thoughts that I really wanted to throw in this year. My questions were few, but there were a lot of the comments on your point. So thank you so much for giving me the time.
Azam Saab, it's always pleasure to listen to a very cultivated mind and think a lot. I think there is a confusion, especially with me, and I want the thinkers like you to take a deliberate and sustained effort to globally solve that issue for other people, not thinking at a pace, but other people. You know, in recent years, I read a very interesting book that interests me more, and that was written by Noah Harari, Sapiens. And the second part was Homo Deus, and that machine would take over. And that interests me a lot, and exactly that 3.2 life, I mean that dovetail somewhere. But now when I see him on Ukraine, he's blatantly lying on the, just taking a, dough from establishment to establishment. And that confuses you. And he's doing it at a time when in Turkey, the Ukrainian ambassador has sought guarantees like Article 5 of the NATO resolution from the countries. And what are the countries? Russia, China, and other. And they are simultaneously taking over the non-nuclear weapon status of the Ukraine. How will they do it? They put inspectors and the sanctions. It means that is totally out of the ambit of the West. And so that creates sort of a confusion to all the thinkers. They don't believe on anything. And that is the post-truth. So I think that would be a great contribution by thinkers like you if you resolve the fundamental reference that someone takes and then move forward.
The final question of this round is side sitting.
Dr. Adil, I have one question. Being an expert, I just want to know, what do you think about it? Suppose the world is coming to an end and you have been given the opportunity to save the world, but you can choose 3 people from the entire world. So who will you choose and why?
I object.
After me.
मैं तो ये पहले तो चाय जो मिलती थी
Because you come from Boston and that was a Boston party.
नहीं सॉरी आपकी मैंने बात कर दी 3 लोगों को अच्छा thank you for thinking for all the questions. They're really good questions, and I do apologize if there is confusion. If there's confusion, it's entirely created by me. Many of them, okay, may I put too many things in this, and I need to clear my own mind. Even as I spoke, I realized. But mera wo okay to get as much discussion every time I'm here. Let me get to a few of these, not necessarily in the order that they came. They're all very good points, and for most of them I don't have an answer. That's the nature of these things. So rather than just make them up. एक चीज जो मेरी अपनी learning on this post-truth वाला चक्कर. I again remember what was it, 7 years ago I gave a talk right in this room. This is the post-truth one. And one way in which I have changed in that time is I think I was also in the trap of thinking that post-truth का मतलब ये है कि there is more lies. I am no longer convinced of that. I think post-truth doesn't mean that there is more lies in the system. There may be. What post-truth means is that there is less truth in the sense that it is absolutely accepted. Right? And that is a function of the information and the knowledge and so on and so forth. So I say this partly as a larger point, that in a way our linear assumption has been that the more we advance, quote unquote, in knowledge, the clearer the truth will become. And it is now clear that that is in fact not so. Right? So अगर आप इसकी framework conditions देख लें, एक condition ये है कि ज़्यादा लोग who are in the conversation, there's more voice. दूसरा ये है कि there's more information flowing on your phone, my phone, brain किधर है, brain में क्या हो रहा है. Right? आज से 40 साल पहले आपको पता ही 4 दिन बाद लगता कि आज क्या हुआ. Right? Speed of information changes, quantity of information changes. Therefore, you should expect that there is more noise. And what we call truth in many things is just not physically possible. So opinion or truth is may confuse us. And so I do want to point out this, post-truth, at least my lesson now is really partly about creating the tolerance for a multiplicity of views. Now, I am also a fan of Noahari. Sapiens much more, Moderator was less clear by, but Sapien was a mind-blowing sort of the first time when he wrote it. The other thing history teaches us कि हमें लोगों को बहुत ज़्यादा judge भी नहीं करना चाहिए. There were many great people. Martin Heidegger became a Nazi sympathizer. Now that doesn't take away from his philosophy. गलती करने का हक हर एक को होना चाहिए और वो उसको रेडी को भी होना चाहिए. And again on Ukraine, I think if we really want to think about it, remember the very learning here, sitting in Boston, especially as this has happened. Ukraine in some ways is for European and people of European descent what 9/11 के बाद any reference to Muslims was to us. वो तब मुझे भी नहीं समझता how immediately it became personal. अब वो सही है गलत है अलग बात. But what I'm saying is one lens to look at the reaction to Ukraine and Europe in particular, but also in many others, right? Is that it is not a reaction to what is happening on the. It is not only a reaction to what's happening on the ground. It is a personal, visceral reaction, and many of us have seen that. You know, when you think about whether it is Islamophobia, whether it is reaction to various incidents. Logically, you would sit back and other people would say, right? But for us, it is a visceral reaction, wherever we are. And in some ways, I think that's the lens by which a lot of Europe is there. And you are exactly right. Such a jhoot hai, mujhe nahi pata, but the European reaction is a very interesting one to look at. Right? Including the fact that Europe में कभी कुछ नहीं हुआ, फिर आप जान जाते नहीं याद हुआ है, बॉस्निया रहता है, वो उधर ही था, कोसोवो याद है, वो भी यूरोप में था, right? And so on and so forth. But again, history is full of that. Not to go too much. Not to go too much into that. Jo education and higher, I think that question should be. Masood online had asked what is the implication of this on higher education. I do think that the biggest implication of this is on higher education. I don't know what that implication is. I know that every thinking higher education institution in the world is grappled with this. The number of meetings I sit in with the leadership at Boston University and other deans, etc., is about the future of education and the future of knowledge. And again, as institutions, it's a very practical conversation. The conversation is कि यार ये सारी हर यूनिवर्सिटी Zoom यूनिवर्सिटी बन जाती है, तो फिर मैं क्या करूँ? Right? Then the conversation is in fact that learning and that knowledge the same as face to face? एक level पे तो वो है, दूसरे level पे what are we teaching? What are we talking about? The university I'm at, if you go to the Boston University page today, you will find, this other page is about this new building. It's about sort of building this totally different type of new school, which is on data sciences. It is breaking the boundaries of all disciplines. So we have schools of science and engineering and social science and international affairs. Right? We are not the only one. About 10 others are doing it. Right? They are responding to that AI by next slide. So I think thinking people all across the world are trying to think about what this means for knowledge. And I think one of the things that it means for knowledge is this agility in knowledge is important, but part of agility takes you back to the basics. Right? And it is not simply you just run after whatever the new thing is. But higher education clearly, I mean, I would say in at least in the US, and I think in the UK also certainly, but certainly in the US, every higher educational institution thinks they are in a moment of redesign. And that has not happened in my 30 years in a higher education institution. Just तरह banks सोचते थे ना आज से 15 साल पहले around the financial crisis के बाद, universities are now thinking like that. Okay, what is going to happen to our norms? What are these? Because all of these trends, right? They are particularly worried, and maybe that is why I was worried because mera kabila wo hai, about work. But in a way, one of the things that I do, if you say, tum kya karte? I help train young people for work. If now I am convinced that I don't know what work will look like, what am I training them for? Right? It's not just capital engineering karni hai, medicine. So that sort of fundamental thing needs to be talked about and needs to be recalculated. Who to act? Yeah, who to act wala hai to sara challenge hai. This is for Shujat Ahmed, who's online. The challenge, particularly that I posed in the last one, or Fukuyama poses in the last one on democracy, is that the custodians of action are no longer the custodians of action. Right? आपकी एक hierarchical system जो था of it comes from Socrates, for example, in politics. Usko bhi democracy nahi pasand thi. He said, democracy basically it should be people who are qualified. Why is it? Right? Why? Society will decide. Or in a way, our election system yahi hai. Elections are not meant to elect the most popular or the most beautiful or the tallest or the most strong. right? It is a more of an idea of those who have somehow the capable.
Don't say that about PMLN. There's going to be people there.
Like the point that people capable of right, and then the question is who is capable and who is not capable. I'm sorry, मैं हमेशा detrack हो जाता हूँ. I'll detrack on one more if you allow me. COVID was again very instructive in this. This is why I started with the note. One of the things, remember COVID के शुरू में there was this sense कि अच्छा democracy जीत गई. नहीं जी वो autocracy जीत गई. आपने देखा है जिसके पास डंडा है उसने COVID संभाल लिया. The fact of the matter is the great surprise of COVID in terms of governance was that there is no correlation whatsoever. Our assumption that rich countries would do better than poor countries failed. Our assumption that democratic countries will do better than autocratic countries, not really. On the other hand, some democratic countries, New Zealand, very good. Some other democratic countries, even Austria, Trump के US को निकाल भी देना, not very good at all. Right? Our assumption that countries which have autocracy and जिनके पास डंडा है और सब बंद कर सकते हैं will do well. Some places it worked very well. In other places it didn't work at all. In some places it worked well at one point, not at another point. Michael Barber and others are pointing out that what came out of that was competence. That suddenly there was a premium on government efficiency rather than government ideology or format. Right. So what I'm trying to get at is that that's the type of things that we're saying. Very, very briefly, multilateralism, I hope you're right. I hope you're right. I'm not so sure, but I hope you're right. In a way, I do sympathize with part of what you were saying. I've heard this argument before, but when I've talked about such things, I've been confronted with the argument that नहीं यार ये जो multilateralism का failure जिसको तुम कह रहे हो शुरू में, जो Germany की मैंने मिसाल दी, is not actually failure. It is like what happens in your airplane instructions. If the plane goes down, first wear your own. Right? It's a decent argument. Okay, जब crisis आता है, you have to save yourself first so that you can save others. And the argument is that what we saw was an individualist reaction, which was needed before the collectivist came. I am not fully convinced that we are seeing collective, but I will give anything in the hope that you are right and I'm wrong on that. I just don't know. The social media wala is an important thing. I think social media is not just social media. In a way, we can get enamored by Twitter or Facebook. Not Twitter, or Facebook. I bet you very soon I'll be talking in this room and we'll be saying something else. जब मैंने वो पहली बार post truth वाले यहाँ talk की थी, I think Twitter was not even a term. Twitter था शायद. Lekin these things will come, something else will come. But the phenomena of that is very important. What that phenomena means is more voice, more fast, transmitted and more widely distributed. उसका नाम Twitter हो, कभी उसका Instagram हो, उसका और Spotify लगाने होते हैं, कुछ भी हो. Those will change, but that dynamic is not going to go back. And therefore, this goes back to the Shriarka question. The answer is not that people will change. The easy answer is that लोगों को ज़रा ख्याल करना चाहिए, ज़्यादा जल्दी नहीं दिखानी चाहिए. But that won't happen. You can't do that with 8 million people. What will happen is that somehow modes of decision making and democracy will evolve. Right now, they seem to be evolving in this very populist, strongman type thing. Lekin, this is again, if you allow me just a sidetrack for a minute. Us din I saw something which did blow my mind. Out of 100 people ever to have lived, jab se insaan dunya mein, 7 are alive today. This is a very fascinating and mind-blowing number. Right? This is the return of democracy. Think about it. Forever. जब से इंसान पूरा अर्थ पे 7 out of every 100 is alive.
Is alive.
Alive. आज जो लोग जिंदा हैं, वो 7% of all people who ever live. Right? This is what geometric progression does. It sounds mind-boggling. वो किसी को मैंने एक उसने कहा चेक का मतलब सिर्फ 7 पूछते हैं, मैंने कहा यार 7 पूछते नहीं है, this is geometric progression, यही तो कमाल है। जो होता है उसका कर्व इसीलिए इस तरह कर दिया। But what that means is this voice argument that I'm saying is and very often I may get hammered for saying this. Very often in this country as well as the US में तो और भी ज़्यादा, it gets confused with the youth argument. As if ये young वाले फर्क है, पुराने वाले फर्क है, वो भी है। But young वाले तो हमेशा फर्क होता है। और young वालों का दूसरा ही होता है कि वो 3 साल बाद young नहीं रहेंगे। उनको सब पता नहीं होता, but हम भी थे कभी young. But the real issue is not young and old. The real issue is voice, right? And the magnitude of voice. That's why that 7 number out of 100 is so. So anyhow, those are some of the thoughts I would have. मैं किन 3 को लेके जाऊँगा? लेकिन मैं अपनी बीवी नाल लेके गया था I have no idea. I do know that Radio Pakistan big show आता था जिसमें कहते थे एक violent because of साथ जाने का उसमें लेकिन I have no idea. I hope that time won't come. What I really hope is that we are a wise species. That we will remain wise. That's what you guys.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
And with all the questions and comments made, there's not much left that I must put in my half a penny as a penny. You hit the nail on the head. The nature of work and the workplace is changing. In fact, it has changed already and will never come back to the old system. And we in Pakistan in particular have not really adjusted because it requires different skills, higher skills, certifiable skills. And this is the weakest point in our economic and let's say productivity section, that we do not have skilled people anywhere. Producing graduates do not work. It's the people who then the carpenter, the baker, the smith, that kind of people. I've had people come to me to do some electrical repairs. Swedish Institute, Gujarat. Diploma kiya 3 saal ka. Can't fix the light properly. He doesn't know what the line codes and neutral codes are. International approval and configuration क्या होनी चाहिए? कहते मैंने पूछा क्या हो गया अभी? तो आता क्यों नहीं? जब theoretical बनाते, experimental नहीं कराते. Now let me come to what you talk about higher education online. I'm not sure of your views, but I personally feel that I've suffered from this. I was working in GIK. We had people. We come from the virtual. Open university. So terrible. Degree number So and also I believe the academic.
So you think this will help?
I think it will not help. Will not help because skills, hands-on, face-to-face interaction is absolutely necessary. And this is the part of the distress in higher education all over the world. So people don't know where to go, what subjects to study. वो बड़ा मसला है पैसे कहाँ से आएंगे आपने बात की इंपीरियलिज्म की आपने बात की फुकुयामा की एक जो टाइम भी होता है 90 साल पहले लिखी थी स्टडी ऑफ वर्ल्ड हिस्ट्री in line with what Moon had written. And I remember one of the arguments he used, history में when two cultures clash, अभी multilateralism की बात नहीं कर, there are only 2 ways that they can interact or react. The Herod king win, and the way as I said. Herod was king of the Jews, and he let them have Jesus to the Romans. But then they don't remember Herod so much as they remember the zealots who fought in Masada and died. But that's another story. You mentioned 8 billion people. I can give you an exact number. When I was born, only 2.1 billion people ever lived on this earth. When I was born, BBC had software, you feed in the data and so on, and kept your whole. Ask Pelican is nothing. I don't think you have a multilateralism in that country. I think your argument was multilateralism will come back.
I think it's
no. I agree with you. I don't think multilateralism was ever there. It was linked very much with imperialism. You only saw a glimpse of it in the mirror reflected, so turned left to right. Why? Because the Second World War, there were major casualties in the European imperial powers. If there had been no Second World War, there would have been no so-called fleet. Now they're coming back again. Coming back again through what you call AI. I do not save anything on the cloud. Why should I hand over something to them? Which was a काम तो करने दो उनको, अगर we track करना ही है. Why do you let yourself be tracked by with Siri and so on? अब मत कीजिए, you get a little more independence. Maps की आपने maps की बात करते हैं. I just sorry, I close like talk too much. When I was studying in Italy, वहाँ पे हमारी यूनिवर्सिटी में PhD करने रफीक अहमद साहब, became VC of Punjab University, Dr. Rafik Ahmed. हम लोग किबला रफीक अहमद खान का था अंडर ग्रेजुएट. एक दिन मुझे कहते शौकत अपने दोस्तों को इकट्ठा करो तुम्हें मैं लेके जाऊँ. And he took us to the British Museum. They were displaying Islamic manuscripts. उसमें एक दो चीज थी वहाँ पे दो चीजें उनकी गाने नक्शा था. Produced a little booklet this thick, 5 millimeters, 6 millimeters, Nagpur style, like a book of knowledge. सारी दुनिया के नक्षत्र उनको के बताते थे कि ये खाने का खाते हैं, मौसम कैसा है, उनके लिबास की ड्राइंग्स बनी वगैरह वगैरह वगैरह. And the funny thing was, north was facing down, south was going up. Even funnier, every map has a reference point. So the reference point was Antal. You reached one 18th, 19th century. Everything was made from there. So these are the things that have happened and that we forgot. And I may also mention that one of my regrets of this multilateralism and Cold War is in 1965 I traveled to England to develop public transport all the way, 34 days. Came by train and bus. Get off here, join the train again after 2-3 days, travel to this country, that country, come back, join it. And nobody asked me for my passport at home. Green passport, Pakistan country. Only at Iran, border was stopped. But I had to wait 2 hours to cross into Iran to travel to Pakistan. But so the world has changed for good and for bad. But I think too much knowledge is also bad. And there's another thing people don't talk about. And I will just pointing this out. This internet, these microwaves going around are bad for our brains. Please. And these high voltage transmission lines, DC transmission lines, they've had experiments in the UK, the UK and in Europe, and they found that even the cows are affected by it. Underground with the ball. There's too much of it. There's too much of this thing going on. So bad for our health. I'm sorry, I'm.
Any last question?
Very short.
Dr. Abid, you were in Turkey a few weeks back, probably doing some diplomatic negotiations regarding. You were there, and Dr. Abid, Suleri, बहुत अच्छा Ukraine और उसका impact क्या है हमारे ऊपर. I would like to know, and the others would also would like to know. Okay, what's your take on experience क्या था? Because where are we heading to? ये जो world है, ये इस conflict के बाद अब किधर पे जा रहा है? जो वो negotiations किया, उसमें given your very right your democracy, work, climate दुनिया आ रही है, उसका क्या take away था? क्या उसमें कोई अपना idea दीजिएगा हमें ताकि पता लगे कि what was the international thinking on it? शेख साहब quickly मैं जोड़ को सब
नहीं इतना ही नहीं था मुझे जब लोगों ने बोला उनको बोला जी मुझे तो राइट.
Sir, I will take that glitch of yours that it's an age of adaptation and will generalize on the whole.
Mic on kar do. Online also.
Thank you, sir. I will take that glitch of that this is the age of adaptation and will generalize on all the 5 points. Although inadvertently we are living to that changes that are happening, but how through our conscious we can realize them and maybe prepare for all these changes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure being a guinea pig to your ideas. You mentioned that in the beginning you asked if the world is actually changing, and if the changes we are, is it the occurrences that we consider changes, they are anything outside of the ordinary. But then there are certain things that are basically due to the lack of any structural changing. Like there are deterioration in the environment, which is an outcome of lack of action or lack of change in our ways. How do we categorize those changes? I'm asking this at the expense of sounding stupid. But
यहाँ पे कोई back जैसे को yeah.
Dr. Abid, ये जो changing world की बात कर रहे हैं, उसी से मेरा aware है कि वो क्या change है.
Thank you and thank you everyone, including lots of things here. I won't go into all of them because they're not questions. You're exactly right. एक तो ये जो आपका, well, not in the order that they were taken, I'll just say thoughts. This point that you're making about change and no change is very important. So, a lot of what changes is because the change doesn't happen. Like climate is a good example at one point, but I don't think it's an example across the board. In some ways, climate action has changed very drastically. Tesla wins, and reduction in emissions loses. Right? This is given as a student. The assumption when I went and started studying climate, the assumption was that the solution will have to require lifestyle changes of some sort that is going to reduce the emission. Ab to koi baat hi nahi karta, environment. We are more technologically cheerleaders of technology. Tesla solved it. Basically, I will not change my lifestyle in anything. I will create a technology that will allow me to. Tesla की इसलिए example अच्छी है कि मुझे ना सिर्फ गाड़ी चाहिए जो बिजली पे चलती है, लेकिन उतनी ही तेज चलती है. 0 to 60 उससे ज़्यादा करती है. Right? And that is a fundamental sort of imbalance that a lot of climate change people used to. अब नहीं करते, अब सबने वो पी लिया. But you are right. So there is also the change that doesn't happen. Though I do think that there is more changing than there is not changing. And I hope I'm wrong in this, and I probably am. Maybe एक भी तो show करती है, but the thing is that we do live in an age of great technological optimism, and we live in the age of technology because a lot of us have these things that we have actually experienced. मेरी माँ जो है वो इस्लामाबाद बैठ के मेरे बच्चों से बॉस्टन में रोज बात कर सकती है. That's a miracle. And we've all seen that, we've lived that, that changes our expectations and so on and so forth. But I think that the point is right. Age of adaptation, and your question was कि age of adaptation करेगा कौन? नहीं.
Yes, sir. We are living to this age of adaptation, but inadvertently. How can we realize it?
Yeah, ये वाली I would say go back to my previous talks right here in this room. I do think, as I've always mentioned, I think there is opportunity in the age of adaptation. The reason मैं इसके पीछे पड़ा रहता हूँ is कि I also don't like talking negative things. I think I'm generally a positive person. To me, age of adaptation has opportunities for developing countries. Why? Adaptation is essentially development. Show me any adaptation project. It's development. Show me any project that anyone claims to be adaptation. अच्छा है, बुरा है, आपको आपकी बात, ठीक है? And I will show you a project that is essentially about development. In a way, this is why I'm saying I do not expect the age of adaptation push to come from industrialized countries, because the age of mitigation, which is what they should be worried about, is essentially about curtailing something. Age of adaptation is about adapting to something. Adaptation is a human success on this planet has mostly been because of adaptation. ठंड आती है आप स्वेटर पहन लेते हैं, adaptation. बारिश होती है आप छतरी ले लेते हैं, adaptation. Right? One of the great human attributes is adaptation. Now, if you, to me, the opportunity in adaptation is that here is an opportunity again to turn climate change into a development discussion. there are many young people here, and I'm sure I hope many of them are environmentalists. One of the things I've realized is my generation, when you came to climate, you essentially had to come from a development direction. You essentially were a bunch of people who were working on development, food pe kar rahe the, poverty pe kar raha tha, and we stumbled onto climate. So our development ka panga bahut strong hai. Currently, at least in what we call the West or the North, rightly so, climate folks come from a carbon management direction. I'm not saying that is wrong. What I'm saying is for countries like us, anything that brings things back to development is a positive. And the onus of shifting the climate change from a carbon focus only, I'm not saying carbon is bad, carbon only focus, to a people-centric, development-centric is on us. That's the age of development to me. The Zoom wala pe sirf main comment karunga and then and I'll end. The Zoom is a very interesting, I don't know the answer to this. Again, because ye meri rozi ka मामला है. Right? मेरी तो रोज का काम है ना. पहले मैंने पढ़ाना है, फिर मैंने अपनी फैकल्टी को कन्विंस करना है कि पढ़ाओ. So it is again existential in that sense. I am convinced that Zoom education has not been a good idea in the US. At this point, it may become, but I am holding my judgment on Pakistan. I am sometimes very enamored by the type of argument that Pravesh Mukhoy, for example, makes, which is the same as yours about skilling. वो कहते हैं कि यार मसला ये है कि आपके पास फिजिक्स के टीचर ही 5, तो बजाय आप 60 यूनिवर्सिटियों में फिजिक्स के टीचर अच्छे, उन 5 को Zoom पे बिठा के रिकॉर्ड करके get really good education out.
These are theoretical physicists.
I agree. बिल्कुल चल जाएगा. हाँ, theoretical में चलेगा, वो lab वाले में नहीं चलेगा. But the point I'm making here is, okay, for all these things, we will have to come up with our own solutions, and they will work in some places. They will develop. Last thing, I think what Umar is talking about, for those who may not have gathered, there was a meeting at Antalya, the Antalya Dialogue 2 weeks ago. अगर आपने अखबार में वो सुना हो कि वो there was this meeting between Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, and the Kabila, the foreign minister of Ukraine. So that meeting was there. It just happened that I was there. Yeah, now usne meri suni, now usne meri suni. All I was a fly on the wall, and I was able to see that conference was mostly about the Taliban and was supposed to be mostly about the Taliban. What did I learn about the world changing? I learned about the world changing in my non-unipolar ki baat karta hu, uska matlab kya. That conference, for example, had I think upward of 30 prime ministers, ministers. But they were from countries that were very different than you would see in a meeting in Pakistan, like OIC, and very different from all the news that I was listening to in the US. And it goes back to my point, in a way, that ordered world where there was a Cold War and everything fell into that is no longer there. Right? And listening to the Prime Minister of Albania, talking about EU membership in Ukraine was totally mind-blowing. I hadn't thought about that. My American experience doesn't square with that, and my Pakistan experience doesn't square with that. And that's what I'm saying. The world is actually a more interesting place than the Pehla wala point. It's a more interesting place than the Cold War orderly formulation was. But I hope, again, I really thank Abid, you and everyone else, and I apologize, this was much more all over the place than usual.
Sorry, probably you know the answer already, but it's worth looking for. What way do the French come in with I understand that Somalians turn to pirates, but this is where French Somalian goes to become French come here. Of course, in North Africa also. So this is what
I didn't know about that, but there is a lot of dumb politics.
And about Tesla, I shudder for Afghanistan when Tesla is the Turkish color. They are the Saudi Arabia of Turkey. Everybody wants Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Adil. आपने बहुत thought-provoking presentation. I will not dare to summarize it. पावर, क्लाइमेट, इंटेलिजेंस, वर्क, डेमोक्रेसी और बाकी सारा कुछ टाइम पे आपने बताया. But of course, change is the only constant in this world. जो global changes जिस तरीके से shift कर रही है, the ideas that you placed here and discussed. I'm sure कि वो जो आपका researcher community बैठी हुई है, ये उनके लिए आदिल ने जब सारे questions आए और जवाब देने से पहले उन्होंने disclaimer दे दिया. तो disclaimer ये था कि I don't have the answers for most of your questions. तो basically वो आपको homework आपको देना चाह रहे हैं कि अब ये आपका काम है कि आप इनके लिए answers ढूंढें. पाकिस्तान के context में, youth के context में, climate change के context में, rural urban disparity के context में, democracy जो भी है उसमें इन shifts में पाकिस्तान आप कहाँ पे place होते हैं, what are the pathways, क्या चीज जो है वो हमें बस ज्यादा बेहतर साइड पे ले जाएगी, उसके अपने जो कॉन्स हैं वो क्या होंगे, तो इन चीजों पे काम करें. आदिल को आप भेजें, ईमेल करें, ट्विटर पे टैग करके ट्वीट्स करें ताकि आदिल का जो नेक्स्ट बुक है उसमें आपको कोट कर सके.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure listening.
Thank you.